with us today. Very grateful for them making the time to discuss these issues and questions are Rupert Schlegelmilch at the European Commission. He's the lead negotiator for relations with the United States at DG Trade. Bernd Lange, chairman of the International Trade Committee at the European Parliament. Jennifer Hillman, professor at the Georgetown Law Center and co-director of the Georgetown University Center for Inclusive Trade and Development. Johanna Lehne, who is the program lead for trade and industrial decarbonization at the climate policy think tank E3G. And last but absolutely not least, Michael Mehling, deputy director of the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, among many other positions that Michael holds. Thank you all very, very much for making the time for this discussion. Before I turn to our speakers, let me just briefly note for our audience that you can ask questions to our panelists via the Slido app on the Bruegel event website. The passcode here is #cooperation. Now, starting with you, Rupert, thanks again so much for making time in your busy agenda to join us. You are the busy leading transatlantic lead negotiator for negotiations with steel and aluminum and critical raw materials on the EU side. Now, the negotiation deadline for the GSA has been moved to January 1st, and the United States has dropped the previous threat of reinstalling the 232 tariffs in case that no agreement can be found. Please help us to shed some light on what the issues of disagreement and prospects for a conclusion are, both for the GSA and the CRM negotiations after the US-EU summit impasse on October 20th. Rupert, over to you.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks for my fellow panelists to be here to talk about this important issue. Let me maybe start by saying I would also like to focus on the prospects and the importance of what we're doing here. Obviously, we were disappointed that we didn't get to results at the summit. It was not for the lack of trying. But I want to step back a minute and just make sure that everybody is fully aware that despite these hiccup, if I can call it that, the case for transatlantic cooperation on trade and climate, as the title of this seminar is, remains extremely strong. I think there are many, many good reasons. I won't enumerate them all, but obviously the trade policy component in helping to fight climate change, to mitigate climate change, is coming into focus not only in these discussions, but in the broader context. More and more people are demanding that all policies help wherever they can. And this focus in the transatlantic space will not go away. There is much more discussion in the US that you probably, other panelists will talk about on trying to square this circle. For us, it remains paramount, especially if you look at the bigger context, when you see the issues we have with in the trading system, where fragmentation and creaks in the WTO system are, you can't deny them. Working together with the United States, with a partner like the United States, remains of utmost importance. I just want to make sure that that is very clear from the beginning. That doesn't mean that we always agree and see eye to eye on all the issues. And the steel agreement, I mean, suffered a little bit maybe from over-complexity from the beginning, because we had a number of objectives. We had 3 objectives on the US, on the EU side. The first one was to get rid of the 232 Trump tariffs. Second one was to do something about decarbonization. And the third one was also to look at ways to deal with overcapacity in general, which are 3 very complicated things. On the US side, the first one was maybe not as strong, but the other 2 were also very strong. And sometimes the complexity of things doesn't allow you to really move as quickly as you want. So we will continue that debate. I will be also very frank to say that one of the key issues was not so much agreeing on how to address overcapacity and how to deal with the trade and carbon issues, but it was also to have a clear idea how we're going to get rid of these tariffs, because these tariffs and these quotas don't work the way we would like them to work. If they would work, we would not have any tariffs to pay, but we still pay $350 million a year in tariffs out of quota exports to the US. So the fact that we have lifted our measures completely while the system that the US has installed doesn't work the way we will remains slightly irritating. But having said this, we will do our best to finalize the work, including having a clear pathway to lifting these tariffs, which was one of the issues where we didn't find 100% agreement at what stage and how we could actually go back to normal trade between us. There was good progress on the other issues. That's also important to note. I think we're getting closer to find WTO-compatible ways to deal with overcapacity. This is fiendishly difficult because certainly as far as we are concerned, we need to be clear that we cannot just put a global tariff on everyone else just because of overcapacity. And we made quite some progress also on how to deal with the carbon issues and safeguard our carbon border adjustment mechanism at the same time. And here I think it's also, I come back to this theme, that these issues are complex. Many of you will know that there is a big debate ongoing how to measure the embedded carbon, not only in the CBAM methodology, where we have a dialogue with other countries as well, but also in the US, which is now being done by the ITC, which is actually reaching out to us, like we did in the TTC, where we have a working group on methodology. To get it right, let's put it like this. If you want to have a carbon element in trade relations, including how you deal with carbon-intensive imports, you have to have a credible methodology. But this is really key, and this is something which we have worked on quite a lot in the last 2 years, and this is something where work will continue. We're going to make another major effort to make sure that in the end, those who think that such a methodology should be applied, and certainly we believe there is a good case to be made to avoid carbon leakage, to put everyone under the same, if you wish, obligations, then some kind of aligned methodology is certainly needed. And that will be another part of the work that we will continue to do with the United States. So please give us a little bit more time. I think we can all agree that what Ambassador Tai has said, that she doesn't want to bring back the 232 tariffs even after these 2 years, is something that resonates well in Europe. We obviously need to think what to do with our suspensions. We will have to discuss with member states a little bit more how to go about this and how to also address the still inherent asymmetry. I'll leave it at that, but I think we are obviously mindful of the time and nobody wants a major escalation at this stage. Now turning to the critical minerals agreement, which is linked in a way that for our climate policy to work, we also have to make sure that we have the necessary inputs, that we have a transatlantic functioning supply chain, irrespective of some of the misgivings we might have on the Inflation Reduction Act because of the local content policies there. I do think we have an interest to do what we can to allow supply chains, European inputs, to be used in our joint effort to build up more capacity, because neither the EU nor the US have major capacity for building the batteries for the time being, just to give an example. That means being clever and not undermining our own efforts, but on the other hand, making sure that we can supply many of the components also to the US. Now, the critical minerals agreement is actually a very simple affair because there's not a lot of trade elements in there. The main issues we're discussing there is sustainability on top of what we already know. We don't want to have export restrictions and things like this. And on labor and environment, we have a path dependency on both sides, which make it sometimes complicated to reconcile our various approaches. There's a lot of, I think, attempts to be very ambitious here, but there are also some approaches that we are not really cited on and don't know whether that's something we should really replicate in the critical minerals agreements. And that is particularly the kind of models which the United States have built up in the USMCA, where there is a very strong mechanism in a bilateral relationship, which is very strong. We were not able to reconcile the US ideas to maybe replicate some of that in one way or the other in a bilateral agreement, and then using that vis-a-vis the supply chain issues we might find elsewhere in the world. Let's put it like this. I think there was partly also because we didn't have enough time to discuss these issues, partly because there's a strong expectation also in the US Congress, I'll be again very frank, that this agreement really breaks new ground in a way that the agreement that the US did with Japan on critical minerals did not do. So we were under a number of external pressures here, which didn't allow us to finalize, I guess, in time this agreement. But again, I think we're all very committed, and the US summit statement actually says it. We're very committed to get this work done. And as soon as we can, and this means this week, next week, we will go back, look at the state of play, and do whatever we can to finalize the work by the deadlines which we have set ourselves, and in particular, still this year. I think as a way of opening, that's all I wanted to say. I think there will be many questions on detail of how we want to construct such an agreement. What about WTO compatibility and so on? But I'd rather wait for the discussion to maybe dig a little bit deeper. Bottom line is, this is a hiccup, but not the end of the world. We'll have to now continue and see when we can actually finish these processes in the interest of strengthening the transatlantic relationship, the way I set out in the beginning. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, Rupert. And it's great to hear that there is progress on finding a WTO compatible solution that protects the integrity of the CBAM, and that there is progress on sort of getting rid of that non-market access capacity import to the transatlantic marketplace, if possible at all. I do, given the amount of progress that you just alluded to, I wondered, whether the Commission will now go and request a mandate from the Council to actually be able to conclude an agreement, and whether there's a prospect perhaps that these negotiations may drag on a little bit further into the next year.
Well, I can answer that question directly. I think after having very good preliminary discussion, the time is now coming very close to actually go and ask for a mandate. We're not there yet, but I think this is certainly on the agenda. Final decision is for my bosses when to exactly go for that.
Thank you so much, Rupert. And now we want to turn to the European Parliament, and as the scrutinizing institution in these negotiations. Bernd, thank you so much. Bernd Lange, thank you so much for being with us today as the chairman of the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament and standing rapporteur for trade relations with the United States. You've obviously followed and scrutinized the development of these negotiations with great care. What are, I'd be particularly interested to hear from you. What the red lines are that the EU should stick to? There's been quite a lot of media leaks running up to the US-EU summit, sort of outlining, US demands and EU responses in these negotiations. What are the red lines that the European Union should stick to? Thank you, Bernd.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David, for the invitation and the possibility to exchange. First of all, I would say that we are really in a dilemma. On the one hand, we are working really close together with the United States in security questions regarding the Russian war against Ukraine, regarding also the terrorist attack in Israel against Israeli people. So we are really close, and perhaps we are a little bit, let's say, bound regarding the other side of the dilemma, the really tough industrial competition to the European Union. And without the first part of this dilemma, I guess we would really go for tough measures against the United States on WTO, no doubt about. And we start the discussion about the Inflation Reduction Act with a clear message that this is violating the WTO. I remember also a wonderful article of Jennifer Hillman on that, that this is the case. But because of the other side of the dilemma, we are really soft at the moment. And that we are really in this competition, I was really recognized once again when I was in San Francisco last week and visiting Tesla. Tesla made totally clear for us that because of the protective measures, because of the IRA, even with a critical mineral agreement, you can forget battery production for electric vehicle in Europe. This will be only done perhaps a little bit in China, but mainly in the United States. So clear message. And therefore, I guess we have to reflect really that on the one hand, we should try to find some compromise with the United States, knowing that at the end of the day, this is not really a proper answer to the problem, but we want also not to escalate. So this means regarding the steel and the critical mineral agreement that we should really stabilize our position regarding our fundamental policies. So WTO compatibility is, I guess, really crucial on the steel side. The respect of our legislation, the CBAM legislation, perhaps using the 2.5 years of data collection in the CBAM also to find some equivalency with policy in the United States. So I guess this is fundamentally clear. And on the critical mineral, I guess we have clear position of the Parliament adopted in the Parliament on the mandate. So that also here the question of WTO compatibility plays a role. The question, why only 5 raw materials covered in the agreement and not 50 like in the Inflation Reduction Act, or the question of recycled raw materials which are not covered. So we want to have a broader approach so that the door is really more open for European products. At the moment, as the agreement stands, it is giving only some advantages to some chemical industries, but this is really quite limited. The United States, of course, I heard always this is a gift to the European Union, but the value of this gift is quite limited. So it's not really in our interest. Specifically, we have also a shortage in these critical raw materials inside the European Union as well. We are now having this critical raw material act. We have a trade partnership with a lot of countries to get these raw materials. And I see not a big volume to export this to the United States. So in total, yeah, let's try to stabilize the situation, not to escalate in the moment in this global environment, but don't give up our fundamental position.
Thank you so much, Bernd. And you know, if I may just stay with you and Rupert for one moment, given that there is, I think we can't deny that leading up to the US-EU summit, there has been a considerable amount of tension and nervousness on behalf of European Union constituencies. How far the European Union would go in these negotiations, and perhaps that might be because what we seem to see in both the GSA and CRM negotiations, that the US side is leveraging the prospect of relief from past WTO violations in the form of a Trump Section 232 tariffs and the IRA's local content requirements to extract trade concessions from the EU under the banner of climate cooperation, and demands that the EU directs trade restrictions against its major international competitor, China, without actually perhaps, or at least in doubt, that they have a robust climate rationale for such measures. And so I wonder, we're going to hear a little bit more from Michael about this, on the issue of carbon tariffs, where, it seems that there's an emerging pattern that even with, strong allies and friends there is, that these WTO inconsistencies are being used to pressure allies into, a political position that is perhaps not the one of those partners. And I wondered, what you sort of expect from cooperation with the United States in the months and years to come. Will this, remain that way? Are you using these negotiations also to set a clear line that this is perhaps not the way to conduct cooperation with the European Union? Rupert, I wonder, what your point of view is here.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a fact that the U.S. trade policy actions very often are seen through the China lens. And this is something which is still there. It's still a very much and slightly different the way that we see a mix of issues with China, where some of them we have to cooperate. Not everything is rivalry. Climate policy is an example. I also think you have competing objectives. As I said, there is a genuine also, I think, attempt in the U.S. with the administration, which is no longer new, by the way, to do something about climate policy. The IRA is in overall a good thing. It has, unfortunately, some detrimental issues for us, but overall, the fact that a lot of money goes into climate mitigation is good. We would have, of course, hoped to do it in a different, non-discriminatory way. So I wouldn't say that anything is. They're using the capital that was built up, if you wish, negative capital by the Trump administration. But it is true that it's very difficult to get rid of these tariffs. It's much more easier to put them in motion than to get rid of them in a delicate policy issue. So I guess the question is, what will it take to domestically make such a move, which is unpopular, at least in some states, which are important for the next election? That comes into play. It's not so much of extracting something from us vis-a-vis China as maybe extracting something from us vis-a-vis the domestic constituencies, with the side effect, and we've been very clear on this. We do not agree with everything that the US does on China. It starts with the 301 tariffs, which we believe and I still believe are illegal. The 301 tariffs and the 232 tariffs, which are equally illegal. And we make no fuss about this. We say that very clearly. And this is, of course, why we're not going to pay with WTO incompatible measures to get rid of another incompatible measure. That is not the way we deal with these things. And this is why one of the most difficult parts of the negotiation was to, if you wish, to keep our hands clean with some of the requests from the United States on how to deal with overcapacity, which, again, this is not black and white. We do believe there is a real issue with overcapacity. And it's not just steel. There is a systemic problem that we will see. We just have discussions now again on solar panels, where prices are going down rapidly because of a lot of capacity. We see electric vehicles capacity coming on streams. The whole petrochemical sector, enormous capacity is being built up. So this is a systemic issue that we have to address. And the classical trade defense instruments are too late and too little. So we have to see how to deal with that. I don't have the answer today, but I think we were working on some of these answers and the discussions with the US.
But I have a different view on that. So because this overcapacity problem is, of course, related to the question of trade policy in general. This position from Catherine Tai, and she made it to me, that they should in China only produce such a volume of steel in relation to the domestic demand is not a proper definition, because Europe is producing much more cars than the European demand is. So this is a principle of trade. And if now we are hit by China because of their production, then we can't say, of course, we are not sticking to the possibility to export European goods to China as well. So I guess we should really look to the question of subsidies, to dumping, and the question of level playing field. So having a fair competition. And secondly, we are faced with a lot of elements which are triggered us. Look to the ban of chips, which have a clear extraterritorial impact to our industry, and this is totally not acceptable. And once again here, we are not really reacting properly. Remember the case with the Iran, where we established an own money exchange institution and really focus on this extraterritorial impact based on the legislation of the United States. And certainly also regarding the climate policy. In the IRA, we have a lot of subsidies, but there is no clear target and no legislation which gives really legal impact to the companies and to society. So there's no guarantee that there will be a proper result of this IRA in reducing CO2.
Thank you so much. Perhaps just to add one of the questions on the overcapacity side, it is somewhat doubtful, or is it perhaps doubtful, whether two countries or one bloc and one country that import 2% and 7% of steel respectively from China, or even less than that, can actually address overcapacity through market access restrictions in any sustainable or effective way. And I, perhaps would like to hear others on that. But we, I think, we have heard quite a lot already. A lot of food for thought, including for Jennifer, who has been watching these negotiations from, the DC, from the other side of the Atlantic, from Washington DC. I wonder, Jennifer, you have been a trade negotiator for and with the United States government in the past, and I'd love to hear. I think we all love to hear your perspective on what has evolved and unfolded in those negotiations running up to the summit and with a prospect for January 1st. Thank you, Jennifer.
Well, thank you. It's a delight and an honor to be here with this panel. And I'll just start at the outset by noting I'm not part of the Biden administration. So nothing I will say has, is in any way based on official, administration positions. For me, I step back from it and sort of have three reactions to sort of what's been happening. I mean, part of it to me is you started, and I think I'm going to repeat a little bit of what Rupert said, but the global steel and aluminum race started with really differing goals. The goal clearly of the United States appeared to be getting the European Union to agree to these restrictions on China, and arguably to agree to restrictions on China that were not WTO consistent. And so the U.S. was sort of using this language. And I understand for the European Union, the primary goal was to get out from under the quotas. Because if you look at the way in which the U.S. imposed the quotas, they're very draconian. I mean, they take an overall quota and then divide it up into, 54 different steel products, and then divide it up by quarters. So you've got all of those divisions, and then divide it up by member states, so that some of these quotas are literally the amount of steel you could carry over in your suitcase. I mean, so in other words, they've made them unusable. I mean, so the way the system works, I'm completely agreeing. So the EU understandably had its number one goal to get out from under these very draconian quotas. The US has this goal of getting the European Union to agree on China, and left out as the number one goal was green. I mean, was really making this all about green steel. And so to me, that's one of the things that we're dealing with right now. That's one of the problems. The second problem that sort of is overshadowing to some degree these negotiations is the current tug of war here in the United States between the executive branch, the United States Trade Representative's Office, and the Congress. Because you are increasingly hearing the Congress say, whoa, you can't be entering into all these agreements unless they go through the Congress in some way. And you're starting to see, again, a lot of members of Congress weigh in on what should be in these agreements and what the process should be for adopting them. I mean, you saw this very clearly. The United States negotiated what was supposed to be the first phase of an agreement with Taiwan. And immediately the Congress said, no, we are going to pass legislation around this Taiwan agreement ultimately passed and supported the Taiwan agreement, but added to it a lot of bells and whistles of, if you come back with anything else, here's the procedure you have to follow. And so to some degree, I worry that the EU is getting caught a little bit into this. I mean, it makes it complicated how much to rely on any allies that you have in the Congress to sort of try to say to the United States, wait a minute, if you actually believe in a rules-based system, you need to think about what you're asking the European Union to do. And the third thing I would say is I do think the US has tried to do a number of workarounds. I mean, I think it became very clear once the IRA passed that it was going to be untenable because of the restrictions on where a car has to be assembled and where you had to get your batteries and where you had to get your critical minerals. So in fairness to the Biden administration, they did allow leased vehicles to come out from under the restrictions, which in the United States is a very big deal because many American consumers do not purchase a car, but they lease it. So that's a big deal. They've obviously tried on the critical mineral side to do this agreement with Japan. But as everyone has said, again, the question is whether the United States is now upping the ante in what it's asking for the European Union. The Japan agreement, again, covered only 5 minerals, so again, not clear how that fits with the overall notion that the IRA has a much bigger scope. But more importantly, it did not have binding or enforceable commitments. It did not have much on labor or environment. So the question is whether now the U.S. is to some degree kind of upping the ante on what they're asking the European Union to do as part of this potential for a critical minerals agreement. So across the board, just my sense is that the concern is that, again, we had very different goals around the green steel and aluminum arrangement. That's one really big concern. That makes it really hard in the end to come down with the deal. And the second one is that US and EU obviously have completely different approaches to climate change, in the sense that the European Union has a carbon pricing mechanism effectively with its emissions trading system and with its carbon border adjustment, which again, I think many would say is the preferable approach. And here in the US, we have very much a regulatory plus now massive subsidy approach. And on the one hand, I just looked at the numbers, okay, we've now seen, according to the White House, $142 billion private investment in EVs and batteries since the IRA passed. $71 billion in private investment in clean energy, $133 billion. These are big, big numbers in clean power. So on the one hand, all of this money sloshing around is clearly moving the needle in that direction. But the concern is whether it's doing it in a way that is going to cause more and more trade frictions as more and more of our trading partners are feeling that they're being pulled into the U.S. market in a way that is unfair. And it makes it really hard to think about how is it that the United States is condemning China for all of its subsidies and turning around on the other hand and granting this massive level of subsidies. So I do think my bottom line advice is sort of two things. Could we please put the green back into the green steel and aluminum agreement arrangement? And secondly, I think there has to be, I'm applauding the EU and saying I think there has to be some pushback on the United States to say, if you believe in a rules-based system, don't ask your trading partners to consistently violate those rules. Find a way to do this in a way that is consistent with the WTO rules. And I think there are lots of ways to do that. I just hope that the United States will agree that it's willing to do that in a way that would be WTO compliant.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for these rich comments. That's truly wonderful and has enlightened us, as regards to U.S. perspective, but also, gives, I think, impetus to those on the EU side who say we have to stick to the rules and not be dragged into WTO inconsistencies for a relatively minor commercial win. I wanted to perhaps just follow up on one thing I think that Rupert alluded to earlier, that is this, the GSA negotiations have been relatively well covered in the media, not so much the CRM negotiations. And many, I think, on the EU side don't really understand or have looked at, what the sticking point here is. That is, seems to be the something that is called the rapid response mechanism in the USMCA. that the US wants to see applied vis-a-vis the European Union as well, if I'm not mistaken. Could you perhaps, enlighten us a little bit on what this really is, this rapid response mechanism?
So I think you're right to flag it, because it is a very new and novel approach to thinking about labor issues in some ways. And the way in which it's really new is that it is a facility-specific approach. In other words, it allows the United States to challenge the labor practices, and really by this, it's a fairly narrow scope of labor practices. It is the right to collective bargaining and the right to form a union. So again, it's a relatively limited set of labor rights. But if the United States believes that there are such violations of those labor rights at an individual facility in Mexico, the United States can request a review and ultimately, at the end of a process, end up imposing tariffs on all goods that are made in that particular facility. So it's not a corporate-wide approach, and it is very far from a country-wide approach, which had always been the view on how do we enforce labor agreements in the past, which is that you said to countries, you have to enforce your labor laws. And if there are a failure to enforce your labor laws, we bring an action against you, the country, the nation itself, for its failure. And this is a significant departure from that to now go down to the level of the individual facility. It's pretty problematic. I would say so far there have been 16 of these rapid response mechanism reviews requested by the United States. Only one of them has proceeded all the way to the request for a panel. In other words, all of the rest of them have been to some degree resolved through a process of negotiations. So part of me says maybe this works, that the record is clear that you're getting a lot of settlements along the way. You're not going all the way through the formal sort of dispute settlement process that is built into it. But on the other hand, I think you're seeing a lot of chafing on the Mexican side that this is quite intrusive to have outsiders, in essence, coming in and examining labor practices at an individual facility. Pretty problematic. Again, if you step back and look at it, more than half of these requests for reviews have been in the automobile or automobile supply chain. And again, the other critics would say, if you look at, other than the first couple cases that involve GM facilities, the vast majority of the facilities that have been targeted for these reviews have been quite small in terms of the number of employees that would be affected. And so the question is whether, if you've gotten better labor practices at 16 small facilities, whether, again, that ends up with much of a systemic change. Again, whether this makes sense between the United States and the European Union, is a very different story. And the one last point I will make is, in theory, this is a reciprocal process where Mexico can challenge labor practices in the United States. But as a practical matter, by the way in which they have defined what is a certified facility, what are the facilities where you can engage in the challenge, as a practical matter, there's basically no challenges against the United States. It's been so far very much a one-way mechanism challenging Mexico.
Thank you so much for explaining that to us, Jennifer. Am I right, Rupert, to believe that this is, a critical issue? It seems rather intrusive, this mechanism, and is this one of the sticking points in the current negotiations?
Well, I think this is indeed one of the issues where we didn't see eye to eye. There is not so much that this would be actually applicable between the EU and the US. The whole question in this agreement was to look at the whole supply chain. And as you know, most of the critical minerals are neither produced nor mined either in the EU or the US. So the question was much more, can you work with a system of this kind vis-a-vis the rest of the world, where we just have doubts whether this is the right way to address labor violations. We have the same objectives. We want to level up, and use this horrible word. We want to increase the protection of labor, of course, and we're doing a lot in the EU, also in our free trade agreements, but we don't necessarily go down and allow complaints of individuals and then have a duty to investigate this somewhere else, which is obviously very complicated. because you need to have access, you need to have facts. It's a political question whether you actually want to do this or not, and we are not really convinced that this would help to really have labor rights respected everywhere in the world. So the debate was not finished on this, but this was obviously not something we could agree on in whatever form, how to deal with the labor issue in the short time that we had.
Thanks so much, Rupert. We're now turning back to what Jennifer called, making green steel green again, or putting the green back into the green steel. Johanna Lehne has kindly joined us, and Johanna and colleagues have written an interesting paper right before the US-EU summit, essentially calling for a reset of global steel and aluminum negotiations, with the US calls the global sustainable steel and aluminum negotiations, and including to really put climate ambitions and climate targets back at the center of these negotiations, which some have argued have so far sort of been rather sidelined. And so I was wondering, Johanna, like essentially your paper finds that none of the proposals that have been put forward on the GSA or GSA negotiation table would actually result in any decarbonization, whether internally or externally. And so you're calling for a new approach, and I wondered if you can elaborate a little bit on this.
Sure, thank you, David, and it's great to be part of this discussion. I'll start with the fact that, as many of the other panelists, Rupert and Jennifer both noted, this is a set of negotiations that was really overloaded with different objectives from the outset. For us as a climate change think tank, we were obviously particularly interested in the objective to use this initiative to really accelerate decarbonization in steel and aluminium sectors globally. And maybe just to take a step back and sort of reinforce why this is so critical from a climate perspective, we're talking steel and aluminium, they account for 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. These are sectors that have for a long time been referred to as hard to abate sectors, but there's a growing base of evidence that really points to the fact that it is technically feasible to transition these sectors now. And we also refer to these sectors as trade trapped. So effectively, these are sectors where commodities are intensely traded, producers are subject to harsh price competition. And this means that policymakers have been reluctant in the past to impose really stringent climate policies for fear of risking carbon leakage and for fear of affecting the competitiveness of these sectors. All of this means that you really need trade policy and you really need a complementary diplomacy strategy if you are going to be able to accelerate these sectors. You cannot make progress at the domestic level without that kind of international piece. And this is where, for us, the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminium, it was originally branded, was a really exciting potential step forward. So when it was launched just ahead of COP26, this was really the EU and the US coming out and really raising expectations of a transformative concept linking climate and trade. Now, as others have reflected 2 years later, it really feels like the climate elements have slightly fallen by the wayside, victim to other very politically charged objectives on both sides of negotiations. It was great to hear from Rupert. This is still central, but this is really key for us. So we know, of course, that the US remains very focused on combating China, protecting their steel industry, worried about the impacts of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism on their steel industry. The EU, for obvious reasons, is very worried about the snapback of the tariffs that form the foundation of the negotiations, getting out from under those quotas that Jennifer was describing. So neither side right now seems very focused on the climate elements. And in fact, we heard in the kind of reporting just ahead of the summit that, some of the decisions on climate in particular were being moved out, into the future towards 2026. It's completely understandable that both sides want to conclude an agreement or some form of arrangement before the end of this year and in advance of elections next year. But our concern is that with another really short timeline, you basically run the risk that what was originally called the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminium simply becomes a bilateral agreement on steel and combating China. And that would really fall short of the initial promise of really giving a global push to steel and aluminium decarbonisation. So for us, it's really about ensuring that that aspect of accelerating decarbonisation remains really central in the negotiations, and that any agreement that is reached is done so in a way that really leaves it open for others to join the arrangement. I think this is a part that was part of the initial communication when the GSA negotiations were launched, this inclusivity element, but again, it's been somewhat underplayed since then. This is really fundamental. The EU and the US account for 12% and 4% of global production in steel and aluminium, respectively. That production share is shrinking, or the vast majority of industrial capacity additions are going to happen in industrial growth markets in Asia. So if you're really trying to move the needle on decarbonisation and in fact on overcapacity, you really need an arrangement that is able to draw on the market power of a much larger set of countries. So in our briefing in the summer, which was before we had the final flurry towards negotiations, we did call for a reset, and we also called for splitting the negotiations into different tracks to try and simplify, as we say, get away from these many objectives that make it so complicated. I think we are seeing a little bit of this right now as the conversations have really focused on overcapacity. The risk is that the most impactful and potentially transformative elements of the deal end up being left on the table. So we really think that in the next 2 months, there needs to be focus on tackling both overcapacity and decarbonisation, obviously respecting each side's red lines and trying to kind of de-escalate the negotiations at the moment, but really ensuring that negotiators don't lose sight of that transformative deal that was initially promised and the potential to kind of go global with something that really greens these supply chains internationally. And so from that perspective, I think there's three immediate things that need to happen. There's ensuring that any deal on non-market excess capacity is not so unattractive that third countries wouldn't eventually sign up to some kind of climate element of the deal further down the line. That rests on the type of measures used. All of us know of the challenges around tariff-based measures, etc., and how explicit, of course, the anti-China framing is in all of this. As a second piece, which is around really reaffirming the commitment to decarbonisation as part of these negotiations, which I'm talking mostly if I hear about political communication, to note that this is central, even if agreement on this is not reached by the end of the year, and recognising that both sides are making progress on decarbonising their sectors domestically. And in that context, a third piece, which is really outlining a roadmap and a timeline for those next steps on decarbonisation. So we know that developing common emissions measuring methodologies is on the table. That's really positive. This should be followed by a sense of, okay, when does that then result in thresholds for defining low emission steel and aluminium, which would be really consequential, and then thinking down the line how those then get linked to trade and procurement measures that really help to kind of green these supply chains globally as well.
Now, thank you so much, Johanna. That's very insightful as regards your political proposals and aspirations. I think that's wonderful. Just one question. I think in defense of the negotiators, there was a ambition or a proposal for both sides to stick or to commit to a legally binding roadmap for the decarbonization of both sides' steel sectors with respect to 2030, 2040, and eventually 2050. And I believe that came out of the EU proposal. So, one wonders, why that hasn't gone forward yet. In a way, one would perhaps imagine that focusing on the domestic side, on the US, on the EU side of decarbonization, rather than sort of devising a club that forces others to decarbonize while domestic legislation is not in place in the club member countries would be the way forward. Do you see that perhaps there's a problem with legitimacy of any kind of club setting that doesn't have these roadmaps for domestic decarbonization, but forces others to decarbonize? Or do you think that the climate club is not dead yet?
We've got climate clubs in different forms these days. We have this sectoral arrangement or negotiation. We have the climate club as per the German G7 initiative that is going to be launched at COP28, which is a very different animal. I would come back to the comments I made at the beginning that I do think when we're looking at industrial decarbonisation, heavy industry sectors, intensely traded commodities, it is very hard to make progress domestically without that international layer. So although ideally, yes, in any kind of diplomatic climate initiative or climate club, you would ideally have progressive members who are setting ambition at a very high level and bringing others into that context by making sure that the benchmark is high enough. I think in the context of these sectors it also makes a lot of sense that some of that ambition comes from having that assurance that you have movement at the international level, that we are understanding what a climate-aligned level playing field looks like in this context, that we understand how we can manage carbon leakage and competitiveness risks. All of those elements, countries coming together to discuss and understand this, to think about how you measure things in comparable ways, those are pieces that help build the confidence that national measures can then be taken. And we saw this in the EU context. We've seen this very clearly. A carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU is part and parcel of ambition in the emissions trading system, and being able to ensure that these sectors are actually facing a true carbon price as we phase out free allocation. The two go hand in hand. This is really a crucial part of it. So I don't think the sequencing is wrong in that sense. I think, yes, a climate club or a sectoral arrangement, there needs to be that ambition amongst members, but it can happen in parallel.
So market access restrictions really as a flanking measure for domestic decarbonization efforts, which brings me to Michael, because Michael has been looking particularly also at recent legislative proposals in the United States that perhaps lack that domestic side of decarbonization objectives. The Senator Cassidy has recently come up with a legislative proposal for a carbon tariff that seems to project, the multi-purpose sort of approach of the United States with regard to climate and trade policy. But Michael, can you help us understand a little bit, what the US side is planning, or what the realm of possibilities is when it comes to unilateral trade measures on behalf of the United States? Thank you.
Sure, David, and thank you also for having me in this really stellar panel. So first, let me emphasize this is not sort of the US position. This is a proposal from one legislator, and it's a Republican legislator. So last Thursday, Bill Cassidy, who is the senior senator from Louisiana, which, as you know, is a petrochemically quite reliant on heavy industry and emissions-intensive industry, introduced a bill together with Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and some other legislators in the Republican caucus that would create what they call a foreign pollution fee. And you already mentioned it. It's a very different beast from the CBAM. Its purposes are multifold. So it describes, holding China accountable, expanding American production and manufacturing jobs, addressing national security concerns, addressing supply chain vulnerabilities, etc. So that alone already shows how the approach and the goals differ from the EU CBAM, which is really more, if you look purely at the CBAM, about leveling the playing field for, emitters that are covered by the EU ETS and the burden they face under the carbon pricing regime. This Cassidy bill also has a much broader scope in terms of the products it covers. So it's got basic materials, just like the CBAM, steel, aluminum, cement, etc. But unlike the CBAM, it also includes fuels, critical minerals, and several manufactured goods such as solar cells or batteries or wind turbines. Again, quite different from the CBAM. And most importantly, and you already alluded to it, it does not adjust for a domestic price. So there is no carbon price like in the EU on industrial emitters. And so that is a challenge that other introduced legislation in this and in the past Congress that would introduce some sort of border fee had to deal with. And the Cassidy bill suggests, well, in fact, it actually expressly says, nothing in this act shall be construed to authorize the creation of any carbon tax, fee, pricing, or other mechanism that imposes additional costs on any covered domestic products. So how do you impose a fee on imports if you don't have a domestic price that you're kind of adjusting for, like the CBAM? And again, this is something other proposals in the US have also faced in the past coming out of the Democratic side. Under the Cassidy bill, the way they would impose this fee is as follows. These covered goods, imports of these covered goods would be charged a fee if they exceed the average carbon intensity of the US, the comparable US product by specified thresholds. And the embedded emissions in these imported goods would not be determined as under the CBAM by reporting from the importer and the foreign producer, but actually based on national averages as estimated by the US National Lab. So quite a different approach there. The fee levels themselves are unknown as yet. So they would still have to be determined when the bill is, if adopted, implemented. And the idea there is that the fees would ensure that the carbon intensity differential falls within a certain trajectory relative to US products over a certain timeline and declines over time. So we don't even know what the fee would be, but it would have to be set high enough to really incentivize emissions reductions from foreign production that continues entering the US market. So there's a lot of estimation, a lot of determination that yet would have to occur. It's quite complex in that way. And any producers that actually want to have their emissions intensity, their actual emissions intensity count, would have to fulfill very, very restrictive requirements, including complying with all US environmental laws to secure some sort of facility-specific agreements. Now, the Cassidy bill also includes something that's quite interesting, negotiating bi- or multilateral international partnership agreements that would waive the fee. It's essentially, you could say, sort of a potential starting point for a club, but the conditions there, again, are quite restrictive. So you'd have to lower trade barriers for US exports, for instance, and share pollution data and verification data, et cetera. So if I very briefly assess sort of how I see and how I would qualify this proposal, I do think it's worth mentioning, you know, that this contributes to a mindset that good environmental performance can be a competitive advantage that can be leveraged for economic gain. So rather than just government intrusion and a cost burden that has to be opposed in a sense. So this could open the door for a climate policy debate in the Republican Party, where still a significant segment remains climate skeptical, including recently appointed House leadership. And so even though this bill, and I think the sponsor himself would acknowledge this, is not expected to go out of committee and have a meaningful floor debate during the current legislative period, especially with the election year coming up, it does kick off a debate. And so I think that's very helpful. It does mute, of course, the incentive for foreign producers abroad, because it just applies these national averages unless you go through these rigmaroles of securing those facility-specific agreements. But really sort of the one silver lining there is that you might avoid circumvention in the form of resource shuffling, which could yet, and we don't know, could yet become a bit of an Achilles heel for the EU CBAM. So, but there are obviously also issues with the approach chosen in the bill, at least the way I see it. And first of all, it's a missed opportunity to try to introduce any kind of policy constraint on industrial emissions in the US that would get US domestic emissions to decline in line with net zero targets and the Paris Agreement commitments, et cetera. And of course, it expressly sort of avoids creating anything such. So the only incentive that remains is a very indirect one, that if US producers become significantly more carbon efficient, then of course their average declines. And so the differential to foreign imports increases. And so the fee and the competitive advantage, if you like, would increase. But that's a very sort of small incentive, I would say. These international partnership agreements sounds good, of course. Collaboration, potentially a starting point for sectoral agreements, sectoral kind of mini clubs, potentially even expanding beyond that. But it could also become problematic. I could see this become a threat to the EU and its CBAM, because it does force anybody who wants to participate in such an agreement and essentially escape the onus of this foreign pollution fee has to adhere to the US approach. And given that this bill also proposes differential treatment for least developed and low-income countries, which the CBAM does not, and that's been a bit of a point of contention around the CBAM, you could see this getting support from a number of countries around the world as they also become maybe then more opposed to the EU CBAM with its approach. But all in all, let me just close by saying again, this is not going to enter into law anytime soon. This is really just the first ante, if you like, from the Republican side. It will, of course, require something if it's to be bipartisan, and that's the reality, I think, in any sort of majorities in this Congress, and of course also after the election, most likely, you would need to have some kind of approach or rapprochement between both sides. So anything that actually sees meaningful debate will look different from this proposal. And I think it's also safe to say, alas, for anybody like myself and yourself, David, who value the EU ETS and the carbon price in the EU, I don't think any proposal, whether Republican or Democratic, will include or introduce a carbon price on industrial emissions in the US anytime soon, at least.
That is, a fascinating insight to the political dynamics on the U.S. side and this particular legislative proposal. As you know, it's a little bit depressing to be honest to hear that and nothing will in fact include a domestic polluter fee in the time to come, or that if that is the conclusion. There is, of course, the White House and the White House's Clean Competition Act, that proposal that seems to be on the dying end when it comes to because it does introduce a domestic carbon fee. We're still hoping for it in Europe, but it seems it seems somewhat unrealistic in the current political context in the United States, which is certainly an interesting conclusion to keep in mind. I wanted to, since time is progressing, we wanted to look at one other issue that maybe perhaps because it doesn't include, it's market negative integration, not market access restrictions, but really looks at the harmonization or alignment or comparability of emission standards that the TTC is the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council is looking at, that is upcoming. In December, will be hosted by the United States in Washington, D.C. We don't have a date yet, I believe, but in December. So, what we are, just a brief look back, the TTC 4 meeting in Sweden in May launched a Transatlantic Initiative for Sustainable Trade and a respective work program that includes continued cooperation on measuring embedded emissions, involving experts from those in Commission services and U.S. agencies responsible for the adoption of relevant methods and standards, building on the work that has already been done in the TTC working group on climate and technology and the technical cooperation in context of the global steel and aluminum arrangement negotiations. Now, it's of course an absolute imperative that the international community develops as fast as possible, easily comparable, aligned, and even harmonized approaches to emission measurement, reporting, and verification. So it's great to see that the TTC aims at making contribution to that end. But what I'd like to ask our distinguished panelists here is to express their thoughts on the opportunities and particularly also the challenges of this line of bilateral cooperation, and perhaps give us a hint of when they expect transatlantic agreements on equivalence, mutual recognition, and harmonization of emission measurement, reporting, and verification to be presented to the public. Or alternatively, if you don't think that this would be a good idea, should such bilateral cooperation perhaps be broadened to include a critical mass of emitters and regulators? And if so, in which fora should such cooperation take place with a view of finding the right balance between effectiveness and inclusivity? And we want to solicit brief comments on this rather broad but yet specific question from in reverse order. And we start with you, Michael. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, David. And I know I spoke a bit longer than my allotted 5 minutes before, so I'll keep it shorter this time around. So, of course, I share the goal. It's a noble and in every sense practically convincing, compelling goal to try to harmonize and lower the patchwork of different approaches, the transaction costs from having to set up compliance frameworks for different kinds of approaches. Makes sense, but I would caution against underestimating the politics, even on what sounds like just a technical thing, namely emissions accounting and MRV, so the quantification and reporting of emissions. On both sides of the Atlantic, industrial emissions are currently being reported. The EU emitters under the monitoring reporting regulation and accreditation verification regulations, so a good 20 years of entrenched, they've invested in managerial capacities, staff capacities, in some cases infrastructure. In the US, under the greenhouse gas reporting rule, which was created in 2009 during the Obama administration. And both are quite different. And my experience speaking with stakeholders so far has already been that they always want to have others to do exactly what they're doing. Nothing less, not a bit weaker, not a bit softer, have to do exactly the same compliance requirements, even with emissions MRV that they face domestically. And they're reluctant to give up something that they've been working and setting up and learning how to do for many, many years. There are differences between both systems that we have to acknowledge. So the EU's approach is very much premised on calculation methods. So you use input data like fuel, for instance, multiply that by emissions factors, combustion, oxidation factors, or you use mass balance approaches, less so remote sensing. And most importantly, it involves mandatory independent third-party verification. Under the greenhouse gas reporting rule in the US, it's mostly reliant on remote sensing, so continuous emissions monitoring systems, quite expensive remote sensors that send data directly to the authority, to the EPA, and it does not require third-party verification. So there are differences, and I think those will become something of a stumbling block for either side to say, okay, we kind of give up our approach, may not be so easy. That said, both approaches do have common ancestry, if you like, in IPCC guidelines that date back to the 90s. And there is sort of a common core in how to calculate emissions. And so going forward, I think for me, the most realistic pathway would be to have something where we kind of agree that there is a minimum that everybody has to fulfill, but then each jurisdiction may have something beyond that, some additional requirement, something that increases reliability and credibility of data for themselves without requiring it from everybody else. Note that the CBAM in its implementing regulation for the transitional period does actually, in the first months, allow for quite a bit of flexibility in what standards foreign polluters apply as long as they meet certain requirements. So that to me would be sort of the path forward, but it is going to be more political, I think, than we'd all hope for.
Thank you so much for this realistic assessment of the opportunities and challenges that are out there. I think perhaps some of us are maybe myself even are too optimistic about the opportunities of harmonization or alignment in this subject area. Johanna, what's your take on the future TTC cooperation on emission measurement?
Thanks, David. I really can only echo what Michael is saying. I was going to make very similar points that basically what sounds often quite sort of, you think, okay, well, measurement, like for like, ton of steel here, it has to be measured in the same way, but actually it is vastly different at the moment. It's very technical, but it's also incredibly political, and it's also subject to a lot of industry lobbying. So something as simple as thinking about what the choice of methodology is, or even the choice of the threshold, that's the next level up from agreeing on a methodology, really benefits different jurisdictions. And if we look, for example, just at the different political economy of steel making in the EU and the US, you already see vastly different interests in how you might define what is green steel, or how you might measure emissions within the steel sector. And we have actually seen very active lobbying on both sides in terms of how the US steelmakers have been trying to define what should go into this type of a process, and on the European side of things. So it is a really tricky thing to get right. There is, I should say, in terms of, you've asked about other fora, this is obviously not just happening within the TTC or the GSA negotiations. This is something that has been pursued within the G7 industrial decarbonisation agenda, and the IEA just last year put forward a report under the behest of the G7 Japanese presidency on emissions accounting methodology, which is really sound actually, and brings a lot of agreement to the table around this. So it is definitely something to build on. You also have lots of different, again, private sector and other organizations who are moving forward with different forms of measurement. So agreements within the IOS, World Steel Responsible Steel. And we are seeing more and more coming together of these organizations to start to say, okay, these are benchmarks, principles for what good looks like here that can be built on. So I guess my main point towards the TTC or the GSA negotiations is build on what is starting to be some form of consensus, even though it is very difficult. And I would very much echo what Michael's saying of, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think interoperability is probably what we're aiming at here versus full alignment. We've seen to date as well how even countries who are very strongly involved in these international processes around it, Germany, for example, then launch their own domestic versions of standards and methodologies and are carving their own path. So there definitely seems to be a shift towards a lot of different processes where hopefully all of these will start to guide towards, decarbonising these sectors as well. And I would also note WTO Secretariat has been doing stuff on this, did a panel in March, which notably had the US and China on the same panel on this issue, which is really interesting. And that this is also a part of the climate club that is expected to be launched at COP28. Pillar 2 also focuses on this. So it's a very active conversation happening in lots and lots of different places. We should be aligning those conversations, making those interoperable, and managing the fact that these should be coming together. But let's not sort of reinvent the wheel in this area as well.
Indeed. I thank you so much, Johanna, and particularly worth highlighting that the WTO indeed hosted a meeting on the harmonization of steel standards, or coherence of steel standards, green steel standards, in this year, where indeed China, the US, and the EU ambassadors were discussing in the same room, which is something that you don't see every day, and should perhaps we should thank the Trade Environment Division of the WTO to do this incredibly valuable work. Jennifer, could you help
I'll
us?
add only very briefly. I'm going to just agree with everything that's been said. I'll just add a couple little interesting or whatever points to think about. One is sort of I think there's generally been a recognition, it may not be perfect, but that we've had systems that everybody agrees to for measuring greenhouse gases at the national level. I mean, the UNFCCC and all of those. We've also had pretty well established and well accepted ways of thinking about overall emissions on a corporate-wide level. In other words, a life cycle corporate-wide level. The problem that I think we're running into now in these negotiations is we now have to start thinking about how much greenhouse gases are in a single item that is traded. And that is adding these levels of complexity to how you think of it. And the problem for that is, even if you could agree on all of the standards for how to figure out how much greenhouse gases are in this particular ton of steel, is whether that's the way the system ought to look at it. Because, as Michael mentioned across this Cassidy bill and many of the other bills, everyone is looking at averages, and often they are national averages. And the reason for doing that is what you don't want is the cherry picking, where countries simply send their cleanest goods out into whatever market regulates carbon prices and keeps their dirty stuff at home or sends it into markets that don't regulate. Well, as soon as you start thinking about something that is not an average, you're permitting that possibility for cherry picking. So I think that just sort of adds another layer of complexity. I will also, though, underscore that I think that what the WTO is doing is really, really helpful to try to say there are standards within the WTO's technical barriers to trade about what constitutes an international standard. And those 6 guidelines, which are transparency, openness, impartiality and consensus, effectiveness and relevance, coherence, and having a development dimension, those 6 criteria for what does it take to create an international standard are well worth thinking about as everybody tries to now come up with a standard that then would have the benefit within the trade world of saying, if you are engaging in activities that are consistent with an international standard, you effectively get a safe harbor at the WTO. You get this notion that you are presumptively not discriminatory or not causing, again, violations of the rules if you have followed a international standard pursuant to the TBT agreement. So there's a carrot out there to try to do this in a way that would be consistent with those principles. And at some level, I'm hopeful that that carrot can also help move us down this road.
Thank you so much. Bernd, would you want to add something to this?
Of course, I could also underline most of the things said by the colleagues. And I'm totally convinced that we really should set our sights low, so kleine Brötchen backen, because at the moment TCC is a good institution as such. So there is a discussion continuously. There's also knowledge about the position. The people know each other, and some elements which gives also impact for the future. I discussed the question of calculation of emissions, and of course there's room for improvement, no doubt about. And we can also discuss some standard setting, and the results is charging plug for heavy-duty vehicles from last time is one element which could fit in the global discussion process. So there are some small progress possible, but in reality, it's totally clear that there will be no law passed the US Congress in this legislative term, and this we have to recognize.
Thank you, Bernd. Rupert, Transatlantic Regulatory Cooperation, over the last 20 years, or let's say 15 years, there was the Transatlantic Economic Council. Now we have the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. We are now back to sort of cooperation on emission standards and green steel standards and verification standards and so on. This has not been particularly successful over in the last 2 decades. Like, what are the prospects of coming to any deliverables that are fruitful, good deliverables on both sides that are satisfactory for both sides at this point?
Thank you. Thank you. You ask a very broad question, and the only thing I want to say on the broad question is that regulatory cooperation, in particular when it comes to equivalence or even joint standard, has always been very complicated. This is because regulators are domestic animals, if I want to call it that. You know, people who work for their domestic constituencies. It's been always difficult to incentivize cooperation, which really looks for the least trade restrictive way to do this. I think what is different these days is that we are really doomed to do better on this area, especially because the world around us is not changing. When we had the Transatlantic Council 20 years ago, whenever it was, I think we were basically, navel-gazing in the EU and the US how to do it. We hadn't really the rest of the world on the screen because we were thinking that either the US or the EU had enough clout to impose whatever came out of our regulatory systems. I think that is changing rapidly, and I think there is a new recognition that working together on these regulatory issues will define the success of some of our industries. And this is also where the transatlantic marketplace idea on the green transition comes in to be much more effective by not having barriers between us, especially on new technologies. I think there is a lot of political recognition that this is needed, but it still is very difficult to get this done at the regulatory level. And if you have looked at the documents that people talk about, you might understand why. There's a lot of technical expertise and approaches and path dependency and tradition, if you wish, even there, the way we do these things across the Atlantic. I'm glad you mentioned this initiative because we nevertheless think we have to do what we can to work on all these issues, to include issues like green procurement, to include issues like embedded emissions that we just talked about right now, but also to talk about standard works, conformity assessment, and all the things that you need for a functioning market. On the embedded emissions piece, which, I mean, many of you had said already, this is very complicated and a lot of stuff is ongoing. I couldn't agree more, and this is why we have been making an effort in the Clean Tech Group, there's a Clean Tech Working Group in the TTC, to start with workshops and getting to know the actors in the EPA on the EU side and everywhere in the transatlantic space to work together. And it's true that it's complicated, but we do see a lot of effort. We see, I mentioned this already, that the United States is now doing this ITC investigation where they're trying to find out what's actually happening in the US. We have the CBAM methodology discussion, which is not finished. So we still have an open door here to talk about how we're going to exactly measure the emissions in CBAM. And even if the results will not be the same, I think there is a growing acknowledgement that if you want to have supply chains, global efforts functioning, you have to have some kind of approach which works, which is compatible. And the one thing that I wanted to add from the global steel where we started, we are agreeing with the US that the carbon pillar might take a bit more time because we need some of these results to actually apply any kind of measure, in particular those who don't have a CBAM type of regime, but that the discussion on the methodology should be opened immediately. And if we had agreed on the 20th of October to actually sign up on this conceptual agreement, we would have invited the next day the others to join the carbon discussion. So this is something which we're not going to wait for us to finish our work, be it in the ITC, in the US, be it in the carbon methodology rollout, and then present the world which is waiting for the results. No, we already thought we better start talking to them today in order to make sure that we all can at some stage have a broader approach, because as many of you have said, bilateral solutions between the EU and the US will not solve the problem. It has to be a global. This is why this whole thing is called the Global Steel Agreement. And this is why I also think in the carbon discussions, we have to bring in the international organizations and make an effort to bring in other interested countries as soon as possible, be it in the WTO, in the IEA, be it in the Global Steel Arrangement, which hopefully will see its light one day. Thank you.
That is wonderful news, Rupert, to all of those who were hoping that indeed, the implementing act for the CBAM, as well as transatlantic cooperation in the various items, would result in a deliverable or some progress for transatlantic and international alignment on measurement, verification, and reporting obligations in various countries. So great to see that you are indeed taking that opportunity, and we look forward to further news on this question. I want to briefly turn, thank you very much all for your time, but I want to briefly turn to the audience that has asked a couple of questions so we want to bring the audience in at this point. One question from a member of the audience is to Michael, who asked whether the foreign pollution fee would be WTO compliant as it is currently drafted, and if not, when would you expect the EU and others to challenge such a measure? Then we have a question on overcapacity. I think that is very pointed. That basically, how would overcapacity? How can the EU ensure that overcapacity will be credibly addressed? Trade defense instruments seem to be ill-equipped to do so. That's alluding to a point that Rupert, I think, has made earlier, and I think it deserves an entire other 90 minutes of discussion. But perhaps I can put these two questions out there for Michael, Rupert, and anybody else who wishes to address them to speak to. I want to start with Michael.
All right, thank you, and I'll keep it short. I think it's a very speculative question. It's a good question. I'm not criticizing the question, but it's extremely speculative to comment on it. Undoubtedly, there are elements in the Foreign Pollution Fee Act compared to the CBAM, for instance, that would seem to make it more vulnerable to WTO challenge. But in fairness, even the CBAM, we don't know what the outcome of a challenge before the WTO dispute settlement body would be. And so it all depends ultimately whether this approach could be considered, justified under Article 20 of the GATT. And primarily it would be then the question, is it arbitrary or otherwise discriminates between countries with, similar circumstances? So the chapeau. And that's hard to predict. There are definitely elements there that are clearly geared towards reducing pollution, albeit not domestically, but abroad. So that's really what it comes down to, weighing those aspects, those considerations. And I don't think the EU would be well served to challenge it. The question is which other trade partners may do so. We would have to have a significant deterioration, I think, of relationships if we have the US challenging the CBAM and the EU, then a fee like this. But again, this is not going to be the final shape of anything the US implements anyway.
Thank you so much, Michael. And again, we have the question of how overcapacity would best be credibly addressed is a question that I would, in fact, want to ask myself. We had previously conversations in leaking to, or, we had media leaks, whether the EU side would address overcapacity in these negotiations via domestic measures, including countervailing duties and trade and anti-dumping measures, or whether a tariff would be installed. And Rupert had earlier indicated that the conventional TDI instruments may not be sufficient. Then the question is, of course, if they're not sufficient, what is the alternative? If a tariff is the alternative, will that be WTO compliant? So I'd be curious to hear a response to that audience question.
Yeah, I think one of the things, maybe starts at a different point here. One of the things that we have done in the global agreement so far is really identify the kind of subsidies where there are gaps in the WTO rulebook. Because we know that the ideal world would be to actually clearly say that if you subsidize in a way which creates overcapacity, which is not so easy to define, but I think you can do it, which basically keeps companies alive, afloat, or loans which are not necessarily market-based, without having this kind of specificity you need for a WTO case. A good subsidy rules which actually level the playing field and have market-based rules applied, I think would be the best way to deal with the issue. But of course, that's something which will be maybe germinating from this Global Steel Agreement, because this will be part of the requirements, I guess, to be able to join this agreement, that you have a kind of avoid some what we would call red box subsidies, which go beyond the WTO. In the meantime, I think you can do a lot, and we probably can do more with the existing instruments to come directly to your question. These issues are already pertinent in some of the instruments we use, in investigations we use. They're not very prominent, I have to say, so we might have to think a little bit about the weighing of different factors in these investigations. So even with that kind of instrument which we have there, you can do probably more than we did in the past. And this is where I think some of the discussion will be going in the next couple of months and years as well. Because we're not going to see a multilateral subsidy regime coming out of the WTO the way we want it anytime soon. So this is part of the toolbox that we have developed. I think since none of the instruments as such that we have out there, be it TDI, be it anti-subsidy, be it other instruments, we also have safeguards available right now, which we still have for a while. All of these, none of them is perfect. And I think a new regime will take time. So we have to use the imperfect tools that we have to do better on the overcapacity issue. This is where this is as far as we can say. We didn't find a final agreement how to actually do it so far. So I would better not speculate too much where we will go with this. But obviously, just a blunt tariff, and I would be very clear, just saying we're going to impose a tariff just without further sort of thoughts on how and why and how much and who, that's not going to work, because that would certainly not stand the WTO test.
Rupert, thank you so much, and thank you all really for taking the time for these 90 minutes, which I think is for the audience in particular was a rich, very rich discussion, and full of insights that were incredibly valuable. I found valuable. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. And hope to see you in other venues, conversations, discussions of this topic, which remains very timely and exciting for the trade and climate geeks among us, and potentially also for the broader public. Thank you so much, and see you next time. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, David.
All right.